Good afternoon. Ipo sound. Good to see you all. Sorry there was a mix-up on the timing and I got here at 12 for 11 o'clock session. But those of you who were able to stay on for a 12:25 reschedule, I'm very pleased to see you all here. The topic they've given me is quite a mouthful. Post-colonial urbanism in India, the Nehruvian vision of modernity. I said I'm no authority on all of that, but I'll give you some thoughts and then perhaps we can have a meaningful exchange. If anything I say provokes your questions, I'll be very happy to respond to them. Forgive me for sitting down and not standing. There's only one reason. I've been suffering from a very nasty cold and cough. And as a result, because it's now running 4 weeks that I've been suffering, my energy levels are low and my exhaustion levels are high. So forgive me, I still have a voice, but not much else. And therefore, I'll stay seated with your permission. Now, when we talk about urban spaces in India, and we talk about Nehru and modernity, it's a very interesting juxtaposition. Because as you know, throughout independence, the dominant motif had been Mahatma Gandhi's vision of India, which was very much of a rural, self-contained collection of villages, all of which would be self-reliant and would be able to cooperate with and trade with each other. There was no particular sense of urbanity in Gandhiji's vision. If you read Hind Swaraj, you'll see what I mean. And yet, of course, Gandhiji was very conscious that you couldn't wish away the great metropolitan urban cities of the colonial era. Because Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, which had essentially been invented by the British, started from there and spread out. And Indian villages were no longer seen by the generation that accompanied Gandhiji in his wake as the full answer to all of India's problems. And so Nehruji did not agree with Gandhiji that the soul of India was in villages. Or maybe he did agree that the soul was in the villages, but he certainly felt that the material body of India would have to be catered to in urban spaces. And just by way of background, I think you all know that he had a very strong emphasis on modernity, on ideas of modernism going back to his university days, his early travel with his father Motilal Nehru to Russia. He had this very strong emphasis, as you know, on cultivating a scientific temper, and he even had it written into the directive principles of the Constitution, that the scientific temper was indispensable for the progress of India. And that's how the creation of the IITs, the AIMS, the Atomic Energy Commission, ISRO in our own backyard of Thiruvananthapuram, all of that is a legacy of this emphasis. In fact, Nehruji was the first ever non-scientist to preside over a session of the Indian Science Congress. That was in December 1937. And having done that, what Nehruji did was he set the tradition of Indian prime ministers always inaugurating the Science Congress, a tradition that has continued until this day. Now, he pointed out in that first inaugural address as president of the Science Congress, it is science alone that can solve the problems of hunger and poverty, of insanitation and illiteracy, of superstition and deadening custom and tradition, of vast resources running to waste, of a rich country inhabited by starving people. So for Nehru, modernity was the answer to the traditional problems of India. And he saw modernity, science, and rationality as a means of conquering these age-old challenges. Now, a historian like Sunil Khilnani has argued that Nehru's understanding of reason even went beyond the issue of the scientific temper. He says that Nehru saw reason, the idea of reason, rationality, and so on, which are very modern ideas, after all, by comparison with tradition, custom, and superstition, as he would see it, that Nehru saw this as a fragile intellectual project and represented instead in his own process of reasoning, the attempt to hold within a mind the range of considerations on how to live. So if you think about that for a minute, that's what ties us into today's topic. Because Nehru used reason to explore various kinds of ways in which human beings could grapple with the answers to the question, how do we live? How do we live includes where we live, what kind of spaces we live in, what kind of books we read, what kind of food we eat, what kind of life we wish to lead. And that is where reason comes in. So, for a scholar like Khilnani, for Nehru, there were two kinds of reasoning. There was scientific reason, that is, that the project of trying to, if you like, bend or adapt the natural world to human purposes. That's where science comes in, scientific reasoning. But the other is what he would have called social reason. That is the project of creating institutions to alter the state and remake society. Now, that's a very important idea, because when you look at the way in which the state is altered, you're also looking at the physical alterations of the state that take place, for example, through the creation of urban spaces. And we'll come back to that in just a minute, but I wanted to plant that particular flag to you, because he did believe, Nehru, that reason was a tool to expand your own moral imagination. Every one of us, in our own minds, we have a brain, we have an imagination, and we have a sense of morality, of what is the right thing to be done, what is our ethical code. It may be something anchored in religious faith. It may be something not anchored in religious faith, but anchored in a belief that one should not hurt one's fellow human beings, humanism as it's called. Whatever it may be, we have reason being used to expand the possibilities of the moral imagination. And that, of course, is where I tie my ideas of Nehru into the question of the urban spaces we are here to discuss. There's a very interesting essay by the famous North Indian architect Romy Khosla, who talks about the new metropolis. Now, he talks about how the metropolitan hubs were essentially developed by the Raj. Right, we all know that. Madras was started by the British, Calcutta was started by the British, Bombay was started by the British. Delhi was certainly an old city. But in the south, certainly, which was our old city, it would have been what we today call Hampi. Vijayanagar was the biggest city at that time. Tanjavur was a big city. Madurai was a big city. But certainly not Chennai, Madras. Certainly not Bombay, Mumbai. And certainly not Calcutta, Kolkata. All of which were actually created by and during the colonial era. Now, in this context, Nehruji came up with the need to demonstrate through our urban spaces a new notion of reasoned urbanity. And that is what led him to commission the city of Chandigarh. Now, critics would say that Chandigarh is a product of Anglo-European imagination, that it's rooted in totally non-Indian ideas of individual liberty, egalitarianism, protection of rights by the state, cleanly ordered streets. That's not our culture, they would say. So I do want to come back to that. But then the third phase, if you like, the post-Nehruvian phase, is what our present rulers call the smart cities of India. I don't know how smart any of them are. I hope you all know that we in Thiruvananthapuram are supposed to have one of the smart cities. And though some of us are doing our best to make it smarter, there's a long way to go, I think, from what the concepts of governance and if you like, high technology governance that is incorporated in the idea of smart cities anywhere else in the world. There's still a long way to go before we get there in India. Now, let me just take each of these phases in turn. I'll certainly want to focus more on Nehru. But just to say that as far as the pre-colonial metropolitan cities that I've mentioned to you emerged as settlements of the Raj and were centers principally of commerce, and then to initially protect their commerce and then to expand their commerce, they became centers of military strength. In other words, if you like, the classic trope would be that what they had in these cities was both money and muscle. They had the money because that's where the money was generated. Ships came into these all port cities, ships came into them. Traders based themselves there, merchant bankers followed and so on. And then you had military muscle, first to fortify and protect these cities and then to expand outward from them. So money and muscle. But in many ways, there was a political purpose behind these urban spaces of the British, which was to encourage Indian, quote-unquote, native elites to move from the protection of indigenous rulers, princes, maharajas, and so on, to a patronage instead and the education instead of the quote-unquote, as Macaulay would see, the superior culture of the empire, by making it to their advantage to relocate to the cities, but not to the same places where the white Englishmen were living. Each of these cities had a so-called white town and a so-called black town. And the white town was the town in which the Europeans, particularly the English, very few other Europeans, lived. And the black town was where people like you and me would have been relegated had we been living in these cities during the colonial era. Then, of course, 1857, you saw the big revolt. You saw the Indian soldiers, Indian revolutionaries rallying under the flag of the aged Mughal emperor. And that was where? That was in Delhi. So it was a reassertion. You've created Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, but for us, our natural center of authority, and that was true of 2/3 of India, not our part of India, but certainly from Tanjavur northwards, the locus of authority in India was deemed to be Delhi. And because of Delhi being the symbol, the British also realized they would have to come to terms with Indian urban spaces as well. So what do? They try to reduce the grandeur of the old Mughal capital in Delhi, Shah Jahanabad. For example, they demolished some of the grand Havelis, mansions, palaces around the Red Fort. When they eventually decided to move their capital to Delhi, and they built the Viceroy's Palace, which we today know as Rashtrapati Bhavan, why do you think they built it on top of a hill, Resina Hill? They did that to ensure that it was higher and taller than any monument from the Mughal era or from old Delhi. Shah Jahanabad was completely dwarfed. Not even the tallest minaret in the Jama Masjid reaches the height of the dome of Rashtrapati Bhavan. So there is always a political statement embedded in the creation of spaces, the allocation of space, where it's put, and the height, the dimensions, the size. If you go to Rashtrapati Bhavan, you can see it as an absolute symbol and footprint of the colonial presence anxious to overawe the subject peoples of India. Their idea was to say, look at this, my God, how can we challenge such a big people? Though it's very amusing that when this entire New Delhi was being built, Rashtrapati Bhavan, North and South Block, India Gate, the whole Kingsway and Queensway, which are now Rajpath and Janpath, when all that was being built, the French president, Georges Clemenceau, came visiting. And he turned to an aide and remarked in French, "This will be the most magnificent of all the ruins of empires. Ça sera le plus magnifique de toutes les ruines." Because he was sure it would not last. In fact, later the British humorist C. Northcote Parkinson used the example of Imperial Delhi as well as the example of the League of Nations to say that you know an institution is doomed when it builds its biggest buildings to house itself. From then onwards, decline is inevitable. That is one of Parkinson's laws, and it's certainly one of the laws that Clemenceau was hinting at. And then, of course, when you look at the kind of attitudes that came to power in our country, there was a sense that earlier hubs would be looked down upon by people of a more conservative or Puritan disposition as cities obsessed with profit, with money making, and where other immoral pleasures could be found. Very famous in both Calcutta and Bombay. And so Delhi had to be different. It had to be a place that incarnated the idea of government and good governance, of reform, and from the point of view of the English when they built it, a place where the Indians would symbolically sit at the feet of the English to learn civilization. It's a pity that no one told them that we were civilized somewhat longer than they had ever been. In fact, when Mahatma Gandhi was asked by a British journalist on his visit to the Round Table Conference in 1930, he was asked, "Mahatma Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?" And Mahatma Gandhi replied, "It would be a very good idea." In other words, it'd be good if the Westerners civilized themselves. Anyway, following the horrors of partition, what happened? We lost some of the biggest towns in Punjab. Lahore was gone, the jewel of Punjab. Lahore was, in those days, about 50% Hindu, 50% Muslim, with some Parsis and Christians and Sikhs, of course. But once it was gone, then all that our Punjab was left with were the relatively small towns like Amritsar, Ludhiana, Bhatinda, and of course, Jalandhar. But there was nothing that Nehruji thought was worthy of rivaling Lahore as a capital of the Indian Punjab. And so that's where the idea of Chandigarh came to his mind. He said, and I quote, "I want to create a new town symbolic of the freedom of India and unfettered by the traditions of the past." Is that interesting? He wanted a town not only that represented freedom, but that was unfettered by the traditions of the past. That old towns were no longer good enough for the new India and the new Punjab. And as a result, there was also, I think, I must say, a concern about the horrors of partition and the need to have something positive and life-affirming in Punjab, where so many people had fled. There had been so much destruction, so much killing, so much displacement, that a new, ambitious urban project seemed to make a lot of sense. So what happened was that the government looked out for architects. They say they could not find a single Indian architect who was up to the task. So they turned to Le Corbusier, the very famous French-speaking Swiss architect, who normally charged for any such project £30,000, British pounds sterling a year. And Nehru said, frankly, we can't afford it. We can give you £3,000, 10% of your usual fee. And to the surprise of many Europeans, Le Corbusier accepted the challenge. Some people were saying that his theories were no longer so acceptable in Europe and there were no takers giving him comparable contracts. And some people, of course, said that it was just an ego trip, not just to build a building or design a space, but to build an entire city from scratch was a tremendous bonus. Be that as it may, Le Corbusier accepted the challenge. He wanted to build a city. This is where he and Nehru saw completely eye to eye. A city that would be a triumph of man and reason. The ladies should forgive us, man in those days was always meant to include both men and women. A triumph of man and reason. And there's no question Nehru has always throughout partially influenced by the Russian Revolution, the triumph of the Soviet experiment, that whole idea that we have seen the future and it is here, that is in Russia. That idea was very much there, and so the fact that the Russians had also tried to move into a much more modern direction while holding on to some of the, so for example, the Kremlin is a pre-revolution building. And so similarly, Rashtrapati Bhavan is a pre-independence building. But the notion of urban space can be expanded to go well beyond the specific legacy of the colonial era. And then what happened was, the way, I don't know how many of you have been to Chandigarh. Can I see any hands? Quite a few of you. Excellent. Well, at least 25%, 20% of you have been there. Chandigarh is a very interesting city, and I would urge the remainder to also consider going, because it is the best planned city in India, and somehow they've managed to stick to the planning. Normally you plan anything in India, and once the basic plan is laid down, people will come and encroach and violate and spread. They managed to preserve most of it. So the way the city is structured represents this triumph of man and reason that Nehru and Le Corbusier talked about. Because at the north of the city, which is the head, if you think of Chandigarh as this reasonable man, if you want, at the head is the legislature, the courts, and the secretariat. There is the main park of the center where the lungs should be, because they are the lungs of the city. And the commercial center of Chandigarh is where the stomach would be, because commerce is only considered and concerned with material things, with physical needs. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I warned you at the beginning. Thank you. Thank you, Ritesh. So the Chandigarh idea is reflective of a sort of socialist ideal, relegating commerce to the stomach, preserving authority at the head, making the park the lungs. All of these are very interesting ideas, and it was in many ways not just meant to be a symbol of a new Indian man or woman, but also a space for each individual, rich or poor, aspiring to live in a society animated by a sense of common freedom. It's the way the socialists and the Fabians, and Nehru was a Fabian socialist, saw the modern world. Where have we come to since then? Since 2014, we have a sort of post-Nehruvian urbanity that has arisen with the smart cities, where the Anglo-European project of the Nehruvian socialist, the Anglo-European freedom project, if you like, was replaced by an American project represented by high-tech, glitzy, materialistic-minded smart cities. And what you're seeing today is smart cities as a symbol of a new India, to use the Prime Minister's words, a new future for India, in which the freedom of fulfilled aspirations will be guaranteed by those who migrate and get employed and integrate into these new smart cities. And the notion would be aspiration, prosperity, the new industrialized or post-industrialized high-tech future of India. Corporations will be much larger in smart cities because they will be providing financing, they'll be providing policy guidance, they'll even be influencing the politics. This is the sort of new perspective. So you have, as I said, three phases. The first being the colonial one, the second being the post-emphasis, post-independence Nehruvian emphasis on freedom and egalitarianism. And now you have the movement to a smart city concept where inequality will inevitably result and freedom will be subordinate in many ways to technology. And I'm happy to answer your questions on that in a minute. What did Nehru say in 1959 when Chandigarh was almost complete? He said, now I have welcomed one great experiment in India, which you know very well, Chandigarh. Many people argue about it. Some dislike it. It is totally immaterial whether you like it or not. This is Nehru publicly saying, totally immaterial whether you like it or not. It is the biggest project of its kind in India. That is why I welcome it. It is the biggest because it hits you on the head, because it makes you think. So once again, the whole Nehruvian idea of reason is coming back into the notion of urbanity. The Chandigarh urban space is worth praising by Nehru because it is big and it makes you think. That's the kind of mind that our first Prime Minister had. I should mention, not just as a footnote, really as an interesting point, that in the aftermath of partition, there was also a very serious refugee problem, particularly Punjab, Delhi, Calcutta, the places near the two partition parts of Pakistan, West and East Pakistan. So how do you find low-cost affordable housing, dignified housing for all these refugees, many of whom had left very prosperous lives in Pakistan to come to India? So Nehru actually created a position of Director of Housing. And again, he did not appoint an Indian. He appointed Otto Königsberger, who is a very famous German architect of that era, Director of Housing under the Ministry of Health. Now, don't ask me why under the Ministry of Health. Some decisions, even of Nehru, are a bit challenging to understand, but we didn't have a Ministry of Urban Development in those days, so maybe that's why. So he charged him with the execution of this mission. And what's interesting is, Otto Königsberger was a Jew in Nazi Germany. And when the fate of concentration camps and execution seemed to be awaiting him, he fled Nazi Germany. Where did he flee to? He fled to India. And in 1939, he took refuge in India, and he stayed till independence, and Nehru gave him this assignment after independence. So what happened was not an unmixed success. There were lots of problems, which I won't go into today, because they're not relevant to today's urban spaces. But Otto Königsberger was the first one in India to make a big issue of low-cost prefabricated housing. He took, for example, ideas like light steel, precast aerated concrete, and started creating housing for the refugees. And Nehru showed through this appointment and the projects that followed that he was determined that urban spaces would have to be about people, that you have to be able to ensure that human beings are able to live with dignity and decency, and that's what he was able to do with this. The same Otto Königsberger was asked to draw up the master plan for Bhuvaneshwari, which was the second planned city after Chandigarh. Chandigarh, of course, is pretty much standalone. Bhuvaneshwar is just near Cuttack, so it's not very far from an old town. And similarly, the third one was which one? Come on, which was the third big planned city of the Nehruvian era? Think of our present Prime Minister and tell me. Gandhinagar, not too far from Ahmedabad. These were the three cities that Nehru devised and planned as modern cities, urban grid layout, all this kind of broad avenues, trees, living spaces, privileging rationality, privileging reason, privileging at the same time the moral imagination of freedom and equality. Now, Nehru was, of course, in addition to all of this, and for my topic today, Chandigarh was the centerpiece, but he was also a significant proponent of modern architecture, and he gave it particular importance because he saw it as a tool to develop a more egalitarian society, a more modern society. Under his watch, very promising Indian architects like Habib Rahman, Achyut Kanvinde, Charles Correa. I had the honor of knowing two of the three. Many of them were trained in America, and they were encouraged to come to Delhi, and Delhi then became a melting pot of modernism. If you go to Chanakyapuri in Delhi, where all the embassy buildings are, some of the embassies are made undoubtedly by Western architects. The American embassy is by Irving Stone. But if you look at some of the other buildings in New Delhi, built post-47, a lot of them reflect these sensibilities. And we have this melting of American, European influence of modernism through the eyes of bright, young, rising Indian architects. The three names I mentioned have all passed away, but now we have a strong anchored tradition of Indian architecture, for which also I believe we need to thank Nehru, because with his support, a new cosmopolitan style, partly inspired by the radical modernism of socialist Europe, was developed. And it was notable for its use of materials that had not previously and traditionally been used in Indian architecture, like concrete. You can say, well, that would have happened inevitably, but you needed a modern sensibility to introduce it here, and that was what was done at this time. If you want to look at buildings in which Nehru took a personal interest and actually inspired their design and construction, you should come to Calcutta and see the Rabindra Bhavan, which houses the Sahitya Academy, the Lalit Kala Academy, the Sangeet Natak Academy. Nehru's whole concept was, even when you are referencing India's rich past and showing respect to its cultural traditions, you must also look to the future, look to reason, look, in other words, to modernity. So that was the topic that I was given by the organizers. I hope you found some ideas there of interest. I'll be very happy to take your questions. The floor is yours. Yes. Are there mics going around? Do tell me who you are so I know where the question's coming from.
Yeah, okay. My name is Gokul. I'm a PG student in Nehruvian College.
Are you an architecture student?
No, English.
English, all right,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay, sir. Great talk, first of all. My question is regarding Jawaharlal Nehru and one among the architecture initiations that he made. That is the Sardar Sarovar Dam across the Narmada.
Sorry, you have to hold the mic a bit closer. I didn't hear your question.
Yeah, okay.
About Jawaharlal Nehru, what was the what?
Sardar Sarovar Dam across the Narmada rivers. Now, that was in, I think, 1961. Now, the greatest criticism that came against this came after 35 years by Arundhati Roy, where she criticized the ecological catastrophes that could follow after the construction of this, and also the displacement of the locals in that area. Now, my question is, like, I would like to hear from you how you deal with this conflict between the architecture, modernity, and ecology. Thank you.
Right, so the fact is that every leader is very much a product of their times. And if you look around the world in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s, not only were dams considered to be the answer to development problems, they were actually tried in both developed countries and developing countries. The famous Tennessee Valley Authority in America is credited with being one of the major projects that pulled America out of the Depression in the 1930s. There are dams all over Europe, and there are dams across the Soviet Union. And so Nehruji said we must have major dams here to harness the power of our waters, promote irrigation, generate electricity. But he always said anybody displaced must be rehabilitated fully. And indeed, you will find that some of the early dam projects, there were no complaints about the rehabilitation. It was pretty good. Some of the later ones, I agree with you. Ecological consciousness in the world really is said to date to the the second half of the 1960s. There is a famous book by Rachel Carlson called Silent Spring, which is considered the first ecological manifesto in the English language, and almost certainly in any language, because nobody is able to point to an earlier book. It was published in either 63 or 64, and then people took a couple of years for the message to soak in. It became a classic. It is still in print. To look for it, Rachel Carlson, Silent Spring. Until then, nobody had decided that ecology was vital. In fact, London was notorious for a pea super fog where you couldn't see beyond your nose in the winter fog. In Los Angeles, the capital of Hollywood, they had a very thick fog. I've seen photographs from the 60s where you literally can't see a building next across the road, rather than, let alone now being able to see the hill. But what happened was the West moved very swiftly on this realization. And London was cleaned up, Los Angeles was cleaned up, major pollution challenges were overcome. And now in most Western urban spaces and rural spaces, the rural spaces anywhere it's true, but Western urban spaces also, the air is breathable, the water is safe to drink, living conditions are decent. Whereas our urbanization took place, and not just us, the same with China, same with many developing countries. went heedlessly towards material prosperity without paying enough attention to the environment. Now, we are the biggest victims of that. Even in terms of material prosperity, we're a victim because it is estimated that 1% of our GDP is lost every year purely in people suffering from respiratory diseases, hospital expenditure, and loss of productivity. So pollution is a very serious problem in our country also. Pollution causes cancer, causes toxins in your body from various dirty waters, all sorts of issues. And of course, it has been estimated that 44% of India's rivers are technically dead. They literally are not live rivers because of the amount of garbage, sewage, etc. that have been thrown into them. So in these cases, it's time for us to wake up and realize that we now have to strike a better balance, and we've struck so far. But to blame Nehru for it seems to me a hell of a stretch, because you're expecting him to have known of something that no one had talked about and analyzed and respected before he died.
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I am Shashi Das, a science writer.
Thank you, sir.
I would like to ask two questions. First of all, I would like to ask you, as you said, Gandhiji's approach was a rural-centric one or village-centric, unlike that of Nehru. His approach is urban-centric, science-centric, high-tech-centric. Is it because of his Cambridge background that is so? That is my first question. So the second question is personal to your style of writing. We have heard of goldsmiths, blacksmiths, but no wordsmith. Why are you so word crazy? Why are you so semantic crazy? Why are you so diction crazy?
All right, on the first one, I don't know if you can blame Cambridge. The fact is that everyone was thinking in a certain way at that time. It was Gandhiji in many ways who was out of step with the times. If you look at Gandhiji's vision of these self-contained, self-reliant village republics, you are looking at a vision which is frankly no longer tenable. It's not tenable economically because many of the 20th century, forget 21st, 20th century's manufacturers require large-scale industry and resources that no one village can produce. You have to have big collection of capital, big collection of labor to produce some of these goods. Secondly, it is also not particularly good socially, as Dr. Ambedkar pointed out in rejecting the Gandhian idea. He said, these villages you're praising were dens of iniquity and sinks of superstition in which my people were discriminated against day after day. We have to move away from this village mentality. So most of the independence generation of leaders, while paying a certain amount of lip service to Gandhiji on this issue of villages, otherwise they admired him for other ways, but on the issue of villages, they paid essentially only lip service. They said, yeah, we'll encourage village industries by selling handicrafts in the big cities, but we want cities. And I don't think that's just Cambridge, though. Ambedkar also went to Cambridge, so if you've got something against Cambridge, I've just given you additional evidence, because both Ambedkar and Nehru went to Cambridge. But the fact is that I think in many ways one could argue that whether we had Nehru or Ambedkar or a third person leading this movement after independence, a certain amount of urban modernity was unavoidable, and that the Gandhian idea was simply not realistic. Even when he propounded it in 1908 in Hind Swaraj, but it was certainly not realistic by 1947. On your second question, look, I enjoy words, but there's also a bit of a joke involved in some of this. As you saw from what I said when I spoke to you all, I genuinely believe in using words to communicate ideas. I'm not interested in using words to obscure ideas or to hide ideas. I want people to understand me, I want people to get the message, and I want people to, of course, at the same time enjoy the words I'm using. That doesn't make me somebody who is, shall we say, opening a dictionary every day. In fact, I probably have opened a dictionary in my life less often than everybody in this room, because my way of acquiring a vocabulary was by reading, not by looking up dictionaries. And when you read widely and indiscriminately, you will come across all sorts of words. And you see one word in 3 different places in 3 different contexts. You'll understand the usage, you'll understand the nuance, you'll understand whether it's meant to be used seriously or jocularly or unpleasantly or admiringly or whatever, and then you'll be able to use that word yourself. I began reading at a very, very young age, and partially because I was blessed by living in India, in an India where there was no TV, no computers, no mobile phones, no Nintendo, no PlayStation, and absolutely no way of actually distracting myself other than through books. And I was an asthmatic child. So lying in bed, struggling to breathe, unable to sleep because of the breath, unable to go out and play with my friends. I was a cricket fanatic, but I couldn't most of the time. I would read. And so reading became my escape as well as my entertainment as well as my education. And through that reading is how I've acquired the vocabulary. If once in a while I use a deliberately funny word, that is only to play along with the joke. Because when I used a word like farrago, I wasn't trying to be funny. It's genuinely a word I've been using since my debating days in St. Stephen's College, Delhi. But somehow I realized that no one knew the word here, which was a bit of a surprise to me. And therefore I realized that since people were playing with this idea that I was somebody using difficult words, and that's why I deliberately use amusingly long words as part of an elaborate joke on myself and on the public. So for example, when I was launching my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, rather than merely saying I'm going to launch my new book on Prime Minister Modi's first term, I said, my new book is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxi nosi nihilipilification. And that had the predictable effect. Everyone leapt at that word, and promptly curiosity about the book went up. And that's what I want is, as an author, I want my books to be read. Meanwhile, I understand that the Reserve Bank of India has used the word floxi nosi nihilipilification in one meeting and one press conference just last week, 10 days ago. So I can take some credit for having injected certain things into our discourse. But it's all in good spirit, good nature. I am not intending to confuse anybody. And when I use a deliberately obscure word, I always provide the meaning, either an attachment to my tweet or whatever. Right, anyone else? Or have I exhausted your curiosity? I did speak longer than I intended to, so there wasn't much time left for questions, but we can take one more question if you like. Yeah, is that a hand up there or is that somebody? Yeah, there is a hand up there. Who has a mic? Oh, there's a hand here. Sorry, sir. Oh, 2 hands there, but there is a hand here already. Go ahead. But the mic is there. This is the era of censorship, as you can see.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tharoor. My name is Atul. I'm a student of I'm a graduate of architecture from CET.
Okay.
And I'm doing my post-graduation in urban design and planning in the University of Milan.
Milan?
Yeah.
Well, all right.
So you had divided the urban planning, the urban policy of India into 3 particular phases: the colonial, the Nehruvian, and the post-2014. But in reality, it's not that much, but because there's been a lot of these 5-year plans in between. And during Nehru's era, there were a lot of migrants, so obviously there was this need for urbanization, suburbanization. But in the last few years, particularly during the UPA 1, the UPA 2, during the JNURM project, the city programs have been increasingly exclusionary. Like we have been trying to drive away the urban poor, whereas during the Nehru's era, we were trying to attract the migrants into the city. Now we are turning our backs. And the current projects, including the smart cities and the Amrit, they've just been, sort of a continuation of the previous JNURM project. So how do you respond to these criticisms?
I can only respond to that by accusing you of overgeneralization. Go to Mumbai and see what we're doing with the urban poor. You can see they've encroached on all the prime real estate. Dharavi, in pure terms of land value, is one of the most expensive slums in the world. If you look at the beaches of Mumbai, which would otherwise be tourist paradises, they're overwhelmed with squatters, fishermen's huts, and so on. And in India, our political culture is such that we don't act against them. We feel it is our failure as a society that we could not give them more decent housing, so we have no right to turf them out. And every time that there is a periodic urban renewal or urban cleaning drive, and somebody creates some new settlement somewhere and moves people out, those people may move out, or some may also come back, but then new migrants will come from the surrounding countryside because we have not been able to tackle agricultural distress either. You know, it's like this old scientific principle of water finding its own level. Human beings will also find their own spaces because you have to live, you have to eat, you have to work. And all of these things, if they're not available to you in your village, you move to the nearest city or the most feasible city. Bombay was not even nearest city for many people. People went from Kerala to work in Bombay. And so you have this culture where the urban poor were accommodated in different ways. Some pulled themselves out of that better than others, but it's there. Now, one of the big differences is that I would argue that we have always, since independence, been far more egalitarian in our treatment of people than the equivalent periods in Western societies. Go to Paris, not very far from Milano, and look at what Haussmann did to create those magnificent boulevards. He literally bulldozed tens of thousands of poor people's homes and slums. He just bulldozed them. And they were not even provided alternative housing. They had to go and fend for themselves. This is 1870s, I'm talking about 70s and 80s. They had the money, they had the muscle, and in the systems of those days, there was no democratic vote to worry about. In India, from 1947, we do worry about the votes of the poor. Democracy has been the best safeguard for the poor, even when it comes to this. So I think you're generalizing too much. There may be examples that will hold your argument up, but I can give you more examples, and you can visually see in any Indian city more examples of the opposite. Now, having said that, there are some successfully managed cases. Thiruvananthapuram, for example. If you go to Rajaji Nagar and see what used to be the Chengalchula colony, you're looking at people who, in many other circumstances in other cities, would have been living absolutely in the dregs. So first, land is provided, buildings are built. Then rightly they complain there's no electricity and water connections. Then the water comes. Finally, the electricity has come. It's taken some years, going back to the chief ministership of A.K. Antony right up to now. But in that period of time, a decent dwelling neighborhood has been created for people who literally had nothing and who had not spent anything on creating this. So I think there is more egalitarianism and successful egalitarianism in our so-called, pseudo-socialist India than there was obviously in the metropolitan period, where people were relegated to black towns, irrespective of socioeconomic status, was merely the color of your skin. And I can agree with you that there may be reason to worry in the new urbanism of the present government. Because the present government has a different attitude. This is the party that said India shining, without asking whom India was shining for. And my worry would be that definitely, in this particular instance, there is a risk that in creating their ideal greenfield spaces for the new urban spaces, for example, they have a plan to create 16 new greenfield towns from scratch along the length of the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor and 2 other corridors in the south. If they're going to do that, they're going to take up land and do it from scratch. What provision will they make for those who provide the services that are required by the prosperous people who are making the industries hum or the high-tech firms hum? Or in the case of Amravati, the government run. They all need cooks and cleaners and drivers and gardeners and automobile mechanics and all of these people. Where are they going to be and what provision has been made for them? This is a question worth asking. But thank you all very much. My time is up. Lovely talking to you. Jai Hind.